Welcome back to the Explainer. So, if you've been following along with our previous lessons, you already know that GAAP provides a highly structured set of rules for accounting. And honestly, most of the time, your questions have a crystal clear answer just waiting for you in the codification. But what happens when you step off the edge of the map and enter the gray zone? Today, we're exploring exactly what to do when standard GAAP rules don't directly apply, which usually happens when you're dealing with brand new or highly unusual business arrangements. We're going to map out those unknown territories together.
Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We're covering how to navigate the gray zone, the mandatory 4-step fallback process, why escalation and controls are absolutely critical, 8 common research mistakes you definitely want to avoid, and finally, making sure you are fully ready for the audit. Think of this as your ultimate survival guide for unmapped accounting.
All right, Section 1, Navigating the Gray Zone. Basically, what to do when you're off the map.
So business moves fast, right? Companies are constantly inventing new revenue models, striking completely unprecedented partnership deals, and creating crazy financial instruments that literally didn't exist 5 years ago. When you face these novel arrangements, you might actually find that explicit GAAP rules simply do not exist yet. So I want to pose a question directly to you. What happens when the rulebook is completely blank? You've searched the codification, you've checked the index, and nothing. Does the blank page mean you get to just make up your own rules? Does it mean you can use whatever method gives you the best-looking numbers for the quarter?
The answer to that is a definitive, absolute no. A blank rulebook is not a license to guess. Guessing is just not an option here. Instead, finding no answer is actually a trigger. It's a signal to initiate a very specific, strict fallback protocol. When the explicit rules run out, the structural logic of GAAP takes over, and you have to follow a rigid hierarchy to find an acceptable treatment. Which brings us to Section 2, the 4-step fallback. This is your compass for unmapped accounting.
Whenever a direct rule is missing, accountants have to use the strict hierarchy of fallbacks. And listen, you cannot skip steps here, and you certainly can't just jump to the easiest conclusion. It is a mandatory, sequential, 4-step process. First, you confirm the GAAP. Second, you apply by analogy. Third, you use the conceptual framework. And finally, step 4, if all else fails, you look to industry practice. Let's break each of these down so you know exactly how to execute them in the real world.
Step 1 is confirming the GAAP. Look, before you confidently declare that no rule exists, you have to prove you actually looked everywhere. A GAAP is only real if you have read the full scope, recognition, and measurement sections of the most relevant topic. You've got to follow all the cross-references and check whether any industry-specific sections apply. And honestly, this next part is the most critical. You must document your exact search path. Saying there's no rule without documented evidence of an exhaustive search is totally unacceptable. In the eyes of an auditor, if you didn't document your search, you didn't do it. Once that GAAP is definitively confirmed, you move to step 2, apply by analogy. This basically means finding a codification topic that deals with transactions that are economically similar to yours. So for instance, let's say your company launches a brand new cryptocurrency reward model that GAAP hasn't explicitly ruled on yet. You might look at traditional software licensing or loyalty program rules. You have to ask yourself, is the underlying economic substance truly similar? And here's the catch. Once you pick an analogy, you must apply those rules consistently. You absolutely cannot cherry-pick the parts of the analogy that you like and ignore the rest. And of course, you have to document exactly why that specific analogy was the best fit. Now, what if no analogy works? Well, your ultimate safety net for step 3 is the conceptual framework. You fall back on the FASB's foundational thinking. While these aren't authoritative GAAP rules themselves, they are the principles that underlie all the specific rules. You evaluate your transaction against these core definitions. Ask yourself, is it truly an asset? Meaning, is it a future economic benefit the company controls from a past event? Is it a liability, a present obligation requiring a future sacrifice of value? Should it be recognized? Like, is it measurable with enough reliability and relevance? And most importantly, does the treatment provide a faithful representation? Does it show what actually happened, completely, neutrally, and without error? If the conceptual framework still doesn't give you a definitive answer, you reach step 4, the absolute last resort. Industry practice. This means looking at treatments that are widely used across an industry, even without an explicit rule. But to use this, you must meet all 4 conditions. The practice has to be truly widespread. It has to be consistently applied. You need documented evidence, like peer financial statements. But hear me loud and clear on this third point. Industry practice cannot conflict with any existing GAAP rule. If an industry practice clashes with the codification always wins. Period. No exceptions. Moving on to Section 3, mandatory escalation and controls. Think of this as the ultimate tripwire. Because you're operating out there in the gray zone, outside of explicit black and white rules, your level of risk increases exponentially. You need a mechanism to protect the integrity of the financial statements. Read this quote carefully. Any conclusion relying on analogy, the conceptual framework, or industry practice involves significant judgment and must reach the manager before being applied, and the team lead needs to review it too. Listen, this mandatory escalation is not some annoying bureaucratic hurdle. It is a vital control. It's literally a shield that protects your judgment, your rationale, and your documentation during an eventual audit. Never, ever apply a fallback conclusion to client financial statements without this formal sign-off. All right, Section 4, 8 common research mistakes. Welcome to the accounting minefield. Knowing these frequent errors in advance is literally the fastest way to avoid stepping on a landmine. Let's pick up the pace and run through these. Mistakes 1 through 4. First up, citing old, superseded guidance. Remember, everything before 2009 was replaced when the codification went live. Old statement numbers are dead. Let them rest in peace. Number 2, skipping the scope section. This is incredibly dangerous, and we'll dig into exactly why in just a second. Third, treating non-authoritative sources as the final answer. Stuff like firm guides, white papers, textbooks, they're great for getting your bearings, but using them as your sole basis without tracing back to a specific codification paragraph, totally indefensible in an audit. And fourth, applying an analogy without writing it down. An undocumented analogy just looks completely arbitrary. If your reasoning isn't clearly on paper before the conclusion is applied, it offers you zero protection if challenged. Actually, let's pause and really look at mistake number 2, skipping the scope section. The crucial point here is that you can never assume a rule applies just because the topic title sounds right. You might find a section that sounds like an absolute perfect match for your transaction, but the scope section might explicitly exclude your specific industry or arrangement. Reading recognition or measurement rules without first verifying you are actually in scope is one of the most consequential, painful errors you can make. Okay, round 2, mistakes 5 through 8. Fifth, ignoring transition guidance when rules change. If you do this, you'll miss key simplifications and definitely generate audit findings from incomplete disclosures. Sixth, missing private companies' simplified options. If you miss these, you're literally just doing unnecessary work, and the client ends up doing far more heavy lifting than required. Seventh, citing the ASU update number instead of the current rule. And eighth, which we just talked about, applying judgment conclusions without manager escalation. As we discussed, any conclusion relying on analogy or principles absolutely requires team lead and manager review. It's mandatory, for sure. Let's take a closer look at mistake number 7, because this is a trap so many people fall into. ASU stands for Accounting Standards Update. Basically, when a rule is being changed, the FASB issues an ASU. But once that update becomes effective, its text is absorbed directly into the permanent codification. You should never cite an ASU update number once it's active. You must always cite the current updated codification paragraph. Think of it like this. The ASU is just the history of the change. The codification is the actual law of the land. And finally, Section 5, ready for the audit, the safe return. So navigating the gray zone isn't about being creatively brilliant, it's about being methodically sound. By strictly using that 4-step fallback, confirming the GAAP, applying by analogy, checking the conceptual framework, and reviewing industry practice, and by carefully dodging those 8 common mistakes, you ensure your work is rock solid. You've mapped the unknown, you've documented your exact path, and you've secured your manager's approval. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. You did everything right. Your research is documented and you feel like it's totally defensible. But will it actually survive the intense scrutiny of a formal audit? What exactly are auditors looking for when they review these highly judgmental areas? And what internal controls guarantee your work holds up under pressure? Well, that is exactly what we're going to unpack in our next explainer. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.